Someone's hero. It was dark, and opening her eyes didn't help, because regardless it was still dark. She heard voices. "We're going to get in trouble," said a youthful voice about 6. "I'll be quick," answered another voice, a young girl, maybe 8. Another voice, maybe about 11, asked, "Did you find her?" "Not yet," said the girl. 11 said, "You probably won't. They say she stays hidden until the fights. Then after she wins, she disappears again." "Like a ghost," 6 said, trying to sound mysterious with his little voice. 11 scoffed, then asked, "So who'd she fight last night?" Before he could answer, the sound of pounding footsteps could be heard, followed by an excited, "She's coming!" shouted out yet another voice with a crack in it, so probably a preteen. The female excitedly asked, "Who is it? Is it the challenger?" "No," replied the preteen. 6 broke in, repeating his question, "Who'd she fight?" The preteen answered and was cut off just as the female and 6 said the same word in unison. "Cass. Mama." Jen couldn't hear the mother, but figured she was communicating somehow, since the children were suddenly silent. It was eerie how quiet they were, even though she even thought they were gone, until she heard all 4 children in unison say, "Yes, Mama." The female quickly added, "But I really want to meet her. She's my hero." Then a tearful 6 added, "It's not fair. I never saw her, and I miss everything because I always have to go to bed early, so I'm never going to see her dragon." "She doesn't have a dragon," the girl said. "So where does she get the fire?" 6 asked. "Duh, you're such a baby," retorted 11. This was followed by crying, and 6 saying, "I'm not," which was followed by the other kids' voices, some defending 6, while others were agreeing that 6 was still a baby, and him crying proved it. Jen wondered if there were more than 4 kids out there, and where did the mama go, until one called out over all the voices, "Now!" "Oh, so that's the mama," thought Jen. There was a shuffling of feet moving away, quickly and noisily. In a similar tone, but a little calmer, Jen heard, "Quietly." The children seemed to become very quiet, although Jen did hear someone whisper, "No, it's your fault, and Mama said not to talk, and you're talking, so I'm telling Mama because she told us not to talk." Alone in the dark, Jen chuckled and thought to herself, "So that's what a mama sounds like. I don't remember mine. I sometimes wonder if I ever had one, although I know I had to have had one, but where is she? Does she remember me?" And then she thought about what the children had said. Alone in the dark, she cried. Okay, side note for the author. I'm not sure. I think it's in the other notebook of pencil scratchings. But there's actually a different version, I'm guessing. It's weird. The whole reason for titling it Someone's Hero is because one of the kids, I believe the girl, says, "She's my hero. I want to find her because she's my hero." And Jen is like, "Oh my goodness, I'm someone's hero. Ah, that's so cool. Would my mom be proud of me if she knew I was someone's hero?" Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, moving on. Anyway, continuing on. The hunt. She was preparing herself to head out, to prepare her stuff for the next fight. Luckily, there was some kind of a colorful parade tonight that would keep people busy. Mad Grass or Party on the Grass or something like that. Regardless of what it was, who wants to get naked and dance anyway? She pulled her hood over her head, past the crowd in the great hall, and reached for the door handle, but was stopped by a guard. His voice was gruff. "Nope, you stay. Challengers must stay within the walls today." She protested. "I've never heard of such rules." He replied with a shrug. "I didn't make 'em, just enforcing 'em." She fumed, but nodded her head and walked away, out of the great hall. From across the room he saw the look on her face go from curious to frustrated to accepting, and then she walked out. He already knew why, him being partially to blame for it. Standing up from his chair, he gave a nod to one of his bruisers, whom took off after her, while Set headed down another hall. Somehow, she always seemed to disappear into thin air, but he was determined to catch her this time, because contrary to her fights, she was not a magic user. He turned the corner and fumed. He didn't know how, but she had done it again. She had disappeared. He waited for a signal from his bruisers, but when there wasn't one, he turned to leave. A curtain moving stopped him. The curtain was hanging at the end of the hallway, covering a big window. He watched it move again, as feet appeared below the floor-length curtain. Quietly he stepped closer and leaned against the wall next to the window. The curtain moved as it shook its head. He leaned in and listened as the curtain spoke. "I hate heights, and there are no close ledges or a tree, so how can I get my stuff?" The curtain sniffed. Then the curtain sniffed a couple more times. "Ooh, I guess I could use a shower," the curtain said as it raised its arms. He smiled and offered, "I might be able to help with that." Immediately the curtain billowed open, revealing Jen, completely surprised, but with a little mixture of anger, shame, and some awkwardness. "Set, what are you doing here?" she asked, a little breathless. "You know it's not often that you hear a curtain talking to itself, so when you do, one must stop to investigate," he said, looking at her while still leaning against the wall. She sighed and started to step back down from the window ledge, saying, "Didn't your mother ever tell you?" But he cut her off, saying, I know. It's rude to eavesdrop." He shrugged. "Of course." She rolled her eyes and said, "Well, no, thank you." He gasped, grabbing his chest, and looked taken aback, saying, "Didn't your mother ever teach you it's rude to refuse help?" She scrunched her eyes. "It is?" she asked, then quickly followed up with a curt "No." But her voice trailed off a little. He wanted to question her on that, but decided later. She was looking out the window again. Remembering he was still there, she asked, "Don't you have anything better to do?" Taking note of the edge in her voice, he crossed his arms and replied, "Actually, no, so give me something to do." "You're kidding." "You have nothing to do," she replied, also crossing her arms, as she continued, adding a pompous air, "You, the boss, have absolutely nothing to do?" He shrugged, replying, "Yep, I'm bored." He finished, but then added, "Oh, and after the other night's performance, people are actually wondering if you are my boss." She chuckled a little, shaking her head, and looked out the window again. "So what do you want me to do, boss?" he asked, smiling and smirking at her. Her head turned slowly as she looked at him, incredulously, but he continued, "It's either you tell me, or I just follow you around all day," he said, smirking at her. She shook her head as she looked out the window again and spoke to the sky. "Of all the audacity!" Then she looked back at him. "You're really going to follow me around all day if I don't give you something to do?" she asked him with a disgusted look. He shrugged, mouthing, "So bored." She rolled her eyes, saying, "Fine. Your job is to find me a way out of here." He smiled. "Well, that's easy," he said, nodding at the window. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not plummet to my death," she said, backing up from the window. Shaking his head, he nudged her aside and climbed out onto the outside window ledge and held his hand out. Now she was shaking her head. "Oh, no, I'm not," she started to say, but looking behind her, he interrupted. "Guards." She turned to look over her shoulder, but he grabbed her and dragged her through the window, saying, "No time," as he swung her out into the open air and around behind him. He expected her to grab onto his back, and she did, but then she went up over the top of his head, as her nails climbed for purchase, anywhere. He felt the unfamiliar stings. Funny, he thought to himself, I usually don't feel nails. She was breathing fast like a scared animal. "Oh, you'll be okay," he said reassuringly, as he grabbed her from above his head and pulled her down in front of him, against his chest. Her fingers scrambled to find clothes, hair, and skin, until her nails snagged onto clothes, hair, and skin, making him wince. But finally she stopped thrashing about. Panting, she pressed against his chest and looked up accusingly at him, saying, "Somehow I don't feel reassured, Set." He said, reaching inside the window and closing the curtain. "Well, maybe that's because you're not positioned very well." Maybe we could go back inside, she said, waving a free hand toward the window. He shook his head, saying, "Nope, at least not until the guards are done with their break. They're right inside." She sighed, pulling her hand back. He grabbed a hold of the ledge again and started to say, "Okay, I'm going to let go of you so I can—" "No!" she said, with big frozen eyes. He corrected himself. "Okay, I'm not going to let go, but you're going to have to unfold your legs and wrap them around my waist." She looked up, giving him a look, so he started to say, "I'll have to let—" But she cut him off, saying, "Okay, okay, okay." Then started unfolding herself one limb at a time as she continued grumbling to herself words that Set couldn't completely follow, but he got the gist and chuckled to himself. When she was done, he said, "Arms around my neck." She sighed, "Fine," drawing the word out as she said it. Looking at what she was doing, she loosely wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingertips barely touching. "Ready?" he asked. She looked back at him, then glanced over the side. "Don't drop me," she says with a shuddering, shaking voice. He smiled and whispered, mouthed, "Never." Then he added, "Hold on tight." Her eyes glanced up, looking for an anchor spot that something should be hanging from, but not finding one, she started frantically looking around. "But Set, where's the ropes?" she asked. His eyes grew wide, looking at her with alarm, like someone whom had forgotten something. "Ah!" she cried out, as they fell all the way down to the next ledge. just below that ledge. "Ropes? Where we're going we don't need ropes," he said, looking at her with a smile. She now securely fastened around his neck, and shaking, suddenly realized that they weren't moving. She pulled away to look at him and respond to his comment, but before she could, he let go of the ledge again. As they dropped, he considered stopping at each ledge to say something and then drop again, but he decided against it as her nails fearfully bit into his skin even deeper. So using one hand to climb, drop, and grab, he used... Where's the rest of that sentence? I don't know. We'll skip that part. He chuckled as she wrapped her arms more tightly around his neck, with her thin arms. She felt strange. It reminded him of a time when he was younger and he was out exploring some lava pits and he fell. His burns were super bad. Even with Neo, it took days to heal. Strangely, it was similar to how he had been feeling for a while now, like his skin was burning, except for when she was around. He dropped down a few more ledges. Oh, author note. Actually, I probably shouldn't have included that because that's from the other story, the crossover thing. Anyway, don't worry about it. Not important. He dropped down a few more ledges, then dropped down into the woods below. It was cooler without the glare of the sun. She sensed the coolness and the change in scenery and put her head up, looking around. Then with an angry grunt, she jumped off of him and stood up a moment, catching her breath, then ran right at him and stopped right in front of him. Her eyes wide and angry, she cried out at him, "Don't ever, 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 ever do that again." He chuckled at her. "Okay," he responded, then added with a smile, "But how do you think you're going to get back up there?" She glanced up. "Not that way," she said, looking back at him. Sighing, she added, "I'll find another way." Then she turned and started walking away. "Whoa, where do you think you're going?" he called out to her. "Thank you, but you've assisted enough. I'll do just fine on my own," she called over her shoulder. His keen hearing picked up voices that weren't theirs. He quickly ran up behind her and grabbed her. "Set!" she cried out until he covered her mouth and dragged her back to an area of the stone wall that was sunk into the small alcove. He stood at the opening, covering her body with his. She was about to protest when she tilted her head and listened. She too could hear some voices coming near. One called out, "Hold, you're trespassing." Set looked at her, winked, then turned his head and looked over his shoulder at the approaching guards. "Am I?" he asked. "Oh, my apologies," the closest guard said. Then he called over his shoulder back to the other guards. "It's Set, sir." Another voice further away called back, "I heard a woman's voice." The closer guard reported a little sheepishly, "Well, he's not alone. It's Set, sir." Jen rolled her eyes, and Set glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, then looked back at the guard. Putting a little edge in his voice, Set said, "You're right, and I'm a little busy, so if you don't mind." The further away guard called out, "Has he seen or know where the Challenger is?" The closer guard pointed to what Set was hiding and asked him, "Is that the Challenger?" Set responded, "You mean that thieving, ugly redhead?" He scoffed, then continued, "Just wait until I get my hands on her. You let me know when you see her." "Yes, sir," the guard said, backing up and turning all the other guards around as well. He tilted his head, appearing to be focused on listening. Set tilted his head, appearing to be focused on listening. She started to speak, but he shook his head. So she continued to silently fume, as she had been. He couldn't help but smile, which made her eyes narrow. The guards were gone, and had been gone, but he had to admit he was getting a kick out of this. He nodded 2, then 3 times, pretending that he heard the guard's footsteps that were very much so now out of range, even for him. He smiled and stepped back away from her. She stayed put, crossing her arms, and said, "I suppose I should be impressed, but I am not. But I suppose I should be." He shrugged, saying, "It worked, didn't it?" "I did what any good employee would do. I protected the boss." "You're saying that your employees would have done that? For you? I mean, sexualized it like that, like you did." He opened his mouth and started to nod. Instead, he paused a moment, then answered, "It worked, didn't it?" She shook her head and started to protest. "That's not—" And then, heaving a big sigh, she rolled her eyes instead. He smiled, glad he had dodged that flying projectile. She walked around him, saying, "Thank you again, but I can take care of myself from here." He moved in front of her. "Nope," he said, grabbing her arms so she could catch up and walk beside her. "I'm going," he said. Then, pointing behind them, added, That was fun. And now you want me to be bored again?" She had stopped walking. He stopped and shook his head. "No way. And besides, now the guards are looking for you, and as I just proved, I'm useful to you," he said, finishing with a sickly smile. She inhaled slowly, looking at him and gauging her options, finally saying, "Fine, but you stay out of my way, and no questions about the arena or before the arena. Is that agreed?" He nodded, saying, "Yes, except I do get one question. A simple one," she warned him. "Sure," he replied. She quickly added, "But I get one first." She paused, then started walking again. He followed beside her. "Do you know why they are looking for me?" He laughed. "Of course. You're the girl who can dance inside a fire. You're big news, so of course they want to show you off in the parade." "They?" she asked. "Yeah, the bosses, the other bosses, running the event. They think you're something to look at. But me, personally," she cut him off, saying, "Oh, that's okay. I already know how you feel about me." He shrugged, looking at her, and said, "Well, can you blame me? I mean, look at you. You have absolutely no fur anywhere." "Yes, I know, and I'm also fully aware of what company you would rather keep." "Oh, really?" he asked with interest. "Well, sure," she replied, adding, "but instead of being wrapped around her finger, you've got her furry, bushy tail wrapped around your throat." He chuckled. "Oh, her. We've hunted together." She nodded her head, mocking her agreement, and said, "Wild game, or each other? Or are they just all the same?" "Ha, ha, ha, ha," he chuckled dryly, then added, "Okay, now for my question." She laughed mockingly. "You're going to use your one question now?" He gave her a look and continued with his question. "The fire dance. How did you not burn? And how did you heal your burns, as if fire never touched you?" Now she was the one to chuckle. "Well, the first question, I'm afraid, is personal and will stay between me and the fishies." He gave her an odd look, but she continued. "For the second question, aloe. I rubbed aloe on my skin." He remembered his thought from earlier, like he had been super burned, and she made it better. They made their way through the woods, taking a longer path, going around the market, instead of through, to get to her hill, her very swampy hill. Leaving him at the bottom so he could stay out of her way, she stepped through the muddy mush and climbed up to her tree, then gasping and crying out no at what she saw. He moved fast up the muddy slide, and what he saw reminded him of his dream. The tree was broken. All the small holes and little cubbies, where she had kept her stuff separate, now had a big gaping gash running through it. Ooh, side note from the author, sorry. I left his dream out. I apologize. She took out her cloak and laid it on the ground, trying to salvage whatever supplies she could. Oddly, with the exception of a few insignificant mixtures, most everything was unbroken and unharmed. Everything except for... His eyes narrowed as he looked up at her. Everything except... Wait a minute, I'm sorry. I apologize, I messed that up. His eyes narrowed as he looked up at her and said, "Bear." She looked at him confused. "I didn't have any bear." Set leaned in again, sniffing the tree as he explained. "He came from the woods," he said as he pointed at the woods. Then he clawed through the tree. He mimicked the clawing with his fingertips, following the bear's claw prints. She moved in closer, lowering herself next to the tree, her knees supporting herself against the tree. His examination of the clues continued. He clawed first this way, and down through here, and then his claws gouged out this area, digging deeper as he tore through the tree's cavities, searching for something. He sniffed as he followed along the trail. But for what? She questioned. He said, adding a little flair to his explanation by reaching inside and scratching at random spots, and then sniffing them as if his scratching had unearthed some secret sense. Then, laying his head down, he listened to the wood. She copied him, laying her head down too. "Can you hear something?" He was quiet a moment. His eyes focused on her as he nodded and said yes. Tiny noises and vibrations. And these particular kind of vibrations mean the attack was recent. He listened more. She couldn't hear or feel anything, but he seemed to. He continued. He was searching for something. Something very special of yours. Something that you kept hidden from him. He looked up at her. Yep, it was something of yours that he really, really wanted. He nodded his head knowingly, and then continued his detecting. "What?" she cried, trying to think of what he, the creature, was and what he could have wanted of hers. He wanted, Set said, still sniffing and touching the tree. He wanted, he said, moving his fingertips over the claw marks again. He wanted... Then he stopped at her knees and looked up at her and said, "Your honey." She shook her head, trying to think. "Bear?" she finally asked, in an almost naive way. He sat down, leaning back against the tree, and nodded. Then, looking at her curiously, asked, "You didn't know that?" She started to shake her head, but stopped, saying, "I mean, of course I did, and it makes sense. Silly old me, I forgot. Bears do like honey. But tigers don't. Oh, but just for fun, they'll steal your honey, hot, if you're not watching it. They'll steal it right off of a tippy-top shelf." He chuckled, asking her, "What?" She answered, "Well, I've studied extensively. In books, I mean. In the world I come from, that would make no sense. It would be utter nonsense. I read about a place called Wonderland that to me makes complete sense, but according to what I've read about from other worlds, it makes no sense. But now in Wonderland all the animals can talk, but here only some animals talk. The ones that have people characteristics, like you. You seem to have parts of a man, at least some parts, but you seem to also have animal parts, of sorts. So then which are you?" He laughed out loud, saying, "Oh, do I?" Then chuckled, adding, but just parts." He cleared his throat and said, "I am supposedly part Vastaya and part human, but I assure you I am all male." She thought a moment, then blushing and rolling her eyes, she started to say, I didn't mean that way," but she sighed and stood up. "Well, anyway, I'm sorry that I wasted your time, but we better head back. Maybe the kitchen has some honey," she said, walking over to her ingredients that she had laid out on her cloak. She moved things to the center while he used his foot to move a few wayward items over to her. "So you're going to let the bear get away with this?" he asked. She shrugged as she folded the cloak and then rolled the open side edges in. "What else can I do? I mean, he must have been hungry." She used some Kevlar vines to tie the cloak ends. Set shook his head and said, "Nah, that bear's a thief and he knows it. Hunt him down. Take it back." She shook her head at him, saying, "I don't want to hurt the bear." Then looking at him questioningly, she asked, "And what makes you call the bear a thief? Or that it's a him?" Set looked at her, then answered, "Oh, because he's been casing these woods. I can smell him all over, and from different times. He's been watching you for a while now." He stared at her as she thought about his words. By now, most females, unless they were super dumb or had been born yesterday, would have rolled their eyes and said, "Yeah, whatever, Set," knowing that he was just joking. But not her. He knew she was intelligent. So then, was she just playing naive? Only one way to find out. Without waiting for her to speak, he continued, "Oh yeah, he's been watching you eat, watching you prepare your mixtures." He pointed at the ingredients in front of her. "And if you've done any bathing here," he said, nodding his head at the water. She looked at him, extra curiously on the last part. "You think he's watched me?" she said, her voice trailing as she glanced at the water. He nodded his head. "Oh yes, you've definitely been watched. And he knows your scent now, so he might start following you." He caught it from you once," he said, standing up, and then added, "Why not again?" She looked up at him confused as she pulled her makeshift bag over her shoulder, but he nodded knowingly, but still wondering how someone so intelligent could be or seem so ... Well, whatever. She stood up, saying, "Well, he doesn't sound like a very nice bear, although," she squinted at him, "I've never read about them having such behaviors." She turned and started climbing down the hill. He jumped off. Then, remembering something, she quickly climbed back up and looked around. I thought it was out here, but I guess I left it in the closet," she thought to herself, climbing back down. She started walking away. "Giving up?" he asked, as she turned in the direction of the arena. She looked back at him. He shook his head and walked closer to her, saying, "You are never boring. So," he said, leaning in, "don't start being so now." "And what do you propose I do?" she asked, holding her ground and continuing. "I've read about hunting, but she started to say, as her voice trailed off. He shook his head. Taking the quiet opportunity, he said, "So you've read, but you've never done?" "Oh, that I find hard to believe." She shrugged. "Well, little things, but that's just setting traps, so no, not really hunting." "So then it's not hard to believe." He laughed and said, "Oh no, I've seen it. I've seen the hunt in your eyes." She was puzzled and asked, "When?" "I've seen you in the arena," he answered. "You watch me fight?" she asked, hinting a small smile. He played it off with a shrug, saying, "Well, sure, I'm obligated to be at some of those things, you know." "Oh, that's true," she said, nodding her head slowly. He smiled and grabbed her by the arm, leading her away from the arena path and back toward the forest, and said, "Come on, time to gain some experience points." At the tree line, he slipped the backpack off of her shoulders. "What?" she questioned. He held it up in front of her, saying, "Lesson 1, be the hunter, not the hunted." He put the bag up on a branch, then dug his nails into the branch on either side of the bag. The marks glowed, and then they darkened. "Why?" she started to say, but he interrupted with his explanation. Too many smells make you the prey. He was right. Even from where she stood, she could smell some of the stronger odors coming from the bag. She nodded, then asked, "But you marked it." He answered, it's like an animal part of me, warning other animals to stay away. And it glowed, she questioned further. Oh, that's the